The day I found out my home was sold was the day I realized my daughter, Madison, had no heart. I spent 30 years as a schoolteacher, saving every single penny to pay off that mortgage. It was my sanctuary, my security, my everything. But because I was struggling with the early stages of Parkinson's, I trusted her. I made her a co-owner, just to help me manage the bills. She looked me in the eye and promised to take care of me. Instead, she sold my entire life to a developer for $1.6 million. She did it to fund a luxury lifestyle and a wardrobe full of designer labels. She did not even tell me. I only found out when the moving trucks arrived at my front door to take my memories away. Madison thought she was being clever, but she made one massive mistake. She forgot to look at the property lines that my late husband, a professional surveyor, had carefully mapped out years ago. Before I tell you how that tiny detail brought her whole world crashing down, I would love to know where you are watching from today. Please leave a comment and tell me which city or state you call home. It is so wonderful to have you here with us. Please note, while this story is a fictional narrative created to engage and inspire, the message it carries about family, love, and integrity is very real. Now, let me tell you exactly what happened next. I spent 30 years of my life standing in a classroom. 30 years. That is 3 decades of early mornings, 3 decades of grading papers, and 3 decades of pouring my heart into the children of this community. I was a public school teacher. It was a job that did not make me rich, but it gave me a sense of purpose. And every single 2-week pay period, I took a portion of that hard-earned money and sent it straight to the bank. I was buying my piece of the American dream. My husband, George, and I bought this house back in the late 1980s. It was a modest cottage on the edge of town, with a wide front porch and a yard that was mostly weeds and dirt. But to us, it was a palace. George was a professional surveyor. He was a man who understood the value of land, and he always told me that a house is more than just 4 walls and a roof. He would say, "This is our sanctuary, Mary. This is where we will build our life." And we did. We spent our weekends painting the shutters and planting oak trees that are now taller than the house itself. I remember the exact feeling of the floorboards under my feet as I walked Madison to her bedroom for the first time. I remember the smell of the turkey cooking every Thanksgiving, and the way the light hit the kitchen table on Sunday mornings. But most of all, I remember the struggle. There were years when the car broke down, or when the roof leaked, and we had to choose between a vacation and a repair. We always chose the house. We worked extra shifts. I took on summer school classes just to make sure we never missed a mortgage payment. That mortgage was a heavy weight on our shoulders for a very long time. Then, 10 years ago, George passed away. It was the hardest thing I've ever had to face. Suddenly, the house felt too quiet, but I kept going. I kept teaching. And finally, 5 years ago, I made that very last payment to the bank. I will never forget that day. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, and I looked at the deed in my hands. The house was mine. 100% mine. I had paid off every penny of that debt with 30 years of my own sweat and tears. At that moment, I felt a level of security that I cannot even describe. I was a widow. I was getting older, but I had my home. No one could ever take it away from me. Or so I thought. I looked out at my garden, at the roses I had tended since they were just tiny stems, and I felt at peace. This house was my safety net. It was my retirement fund, and my legacy for Madison. I believed that as long as I had these walls, I would be okay. I had no idea that the person I loved most in the world, my own daughter, was already looking at my sanctuary and seeing nothing but a paycheck. It started with a single drop of coffee, a tiny, insignificant, brown stain on my favorite white lace tablecloth. I remember looking at my hand and wondering why it had jumped. I was not cold. I was not startled. But my right hand, The hand that had held a piece of chalk for 30 years was shaking. It was a very small tremor, just a faint vibration in my thumb and forefinger. But it felt like an earthquake in my soul. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself that I was just tired. I told myself that I had drunk too much caffeine. But as the weeks turned into months, the shaking did not go away. It became a constant companion. It was there when I tried to button my cardigan in the morning. It was there when I tried to sign my name on a birthday card. And eventually, it was there when I tried to handle the one thing that had always given me a sense of order: my paperwork. In my house, the kitchen table was my command center. That is where I kept my leather-bound ledger, my pen holder, and my neat stacks of bills. I took pride in being organized. I knew exactly when the property taxes were due. I knew the balance of my savings account down to the very last cent. But now, the papers seemed like enemies. The lines on the forms were too small. The numbers seemed to dance and blur before my eyes. One afternoon, I sat down to pay the utility bill. I picked up my pen, but my hand would not cooperate. The pen felt like it weighed 20 pounds. Every time I tried to write a 5 or an 8, the tremor would pull my hand away. I looked down at the check and saw a jagged, messy scrawl that did not look like my handwriting at all. It looked like the writing of a stranger, a very old, very weak stranger. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. For a teacher, losing your ability to write is like losing your voice. It is a loss of identity. I sat there, in the silence of my kitchen, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly vulnerable. I felt like the walls of my sanctuary were beginning to crumble. Then came the official diagnosis. The doctor said it was the early stage. He spoke about dopamine and neurological pathways. How would I keep up with the maintenance? How would I manage the insurance forms? The American healthcare system is a maze of fine print, and I was already getting lost in it. I started to forget things too. Small things at first. I would leave the garden hose running for an hour, or I would forget where I put the spare key to the garage. But then, I missed a payment on the homeowner's insurance. I received a notice in the mail with red letters. It was a warning. My heart raced as I read it. I had never, in my entire adult life, missed a deadline. The stress of the illness was making the symptoms worse. When I got anxious, the shaking became more violent. I started to avoid the mail altogether. I would see the white envelopes piling up on the entryway table, and I would just walk past them. I told myself I would deal with them tomorrow. But tomorrow always felt more difficult than today. I felt so alone. George was gone. My friends from the school district were all busy with their own grandchildren or their own health problems. I did not want to be a burden. I did not want to admit that I was struggling. In America, we are taught to be independent. We are taught to pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. But my straps were fraying, and I was starting to slip. Every night, I would sit on my porch and look at the sunset. I would pray for strength. I would pray for a way to keep my home. I worked so hard for this house. 30 years of teaching, 30 years of sacrifice. I could not let it go, but the bills were still there, sitting on the table, waiting for a hand that did not shake. I needed help. I was drowning in a sea of paper, and I was just waiting for someone to throw me a lifeline. That lifeline appeared on a Tuesday afternoon, in the form of my daughter, Madison. She arrived at the house with a warm smile and a bag of my favorite groceries. She looked so beautiful, so successful, so full of life. She was 29 years old, working in marketing downtown, and she always seemed to have everything under control. "Mom, you look tired," she said, as she walked into the kitchen and saw the stack of unopened mail. I tried to hide the tremor by tucking my hand under my thigh, but she was too quick. She noticed. She walked over and gently touched my shoulder. Her voice was soft. like a warm blanket on a cold night. Why didn't you tell me you were struggling with the paperwork? I felt a lump in my throat. I didn't want to worry you. Honey, I whispered. It is just Parkinson's. It makes the pen feel slippery. Madison pulled up a chair and sat down next to me. She started sorting through the envelopes with an efficiency that reminded me of myself when I was younger. Mom, you cannot do this alone anymore. It is too much stress for you. The doctor said you need to focus on your health, not on property taxes and utility bills. I nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. It felt so good to have someone else take charge. Madison spent the next hour organizing everything. She made a list. She called the insurance company. She was my hero. Then she sat back and looked at me with a very serious expression. I have been thinking. Mom, there is a way to make this much easier for both of us. We should change the deed to the house. We should make it a joint ownership, with both of our names on it. I hesitated. My home was my only real asset. It was the only thing I truly owned. Joint ownership? I asked. Why would we need to do that? Madison reached out and took my shaking hand in both of hers. Her hands were steady and strong. It is just to make things easier for the bills. Mom, she said with a sweet smile, if my name is on the deed, I can handle the bank, the maintenance, and the legal stuff, without having to ask for your permission every single time. It protects you. If anything happens to you, the house stays in the family automatically. No probate. No lawyers. No headaches. She leaned in closer. Her eyes filled with what I thought was genuine concern. I just want you to be able to enjoy your retirement. I want you to sit in your garden and read your books. Let me carry the heavy lifting. I am your daughter. I love you. Don't you trust me? Those 4 words, don't you trust me, were the key. Of course I trusted her. I had raised her. I had cheered for her at her graduation. I had supported her through every breakup and every job change. She was my only child. If I could not trust my own daughter, who could I trust? I do trust you. Madison, I said. My voice was shaky, but I meant it. The very next week, she brought over a notary and a set of legal documents. My eyes were still blurry, and my hand was still trembling. Madison pointed to the line where I needed to sign. Right here. Mom, just a quick signature, and everything will be taken care of. You won't have to worry about a single bill ever again. I took the pen. I focused all of my energy on that one moment. I managed to sign my name. It was messy, but it was legal. I felt a strange mixture of emotions. There was a small part of me, a tiny voice in the back of my mind, that felt a sense of loss. It was the feeling of letting go, but the larger part of me felt a massive weight lift off my shoulders. There we go, Madison said, her voice sounding slightly different, perhaps a bit more crisp. She tucked the papers into her expensive designer briefcase. Everything is handled now. You just focus on your health. I will take care of the rest. As she walked out the door that day, she did not look back. I stood at the window and watched her drive away in her shiny car. I felt grateful. I thought I had found a way to save my sanctuary. I thought I had secured my future. I had no idea that I had just handed the keys to my life to a person who saw my 30 years of devotion as nothing more than a real estate transaction. I had given her my trust, and she was already planning to sell it to the highest bidder. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind of quiet, golden morning that I used to cherish. I was sitting in my favorite armchair by the window, the one George bought me for our 20th wedding anniversary. I had a warm cup of herbal tea in my hand, and I was watching a pair of blue jays splashing in the bird bath I had placed in the garden 10 years ago. For a brief moment, my tremors were calm. I felt a sense of peace. I thought that, maybe, just maybe, Madison was right. Maybe letting her handle the paperwork was the best decision I ever made. But then, the silence of the neighborhood was shattered. I heard the heavy, rhythmic rumble of a large engine. Then another. I looked out the window and saw two massive, white moving trucks pulling up to the curb. They were the kind of trucks you see when someone is moving across the country. They were huge. They blocked the view of the street. My heart began to thump against my ribs. I thought there must be a mistake. Maybe they were at the wrong address. Maybe the neighbors were moving. But then, 4 men in grey uniforms stepped out of the trucks. They were carrying rolls of packing tape, stacks of cardboard boxes, and heavy-duty moving blankets. They walked straight toward my front door. I stood up, my tea splashing onto my saucer as my hand began to shake violently. I hurried to the door, as best as I could, my legs feeling heavy and stiff. When I opened the door, the lead mover, a tall man with a clipboard, looked at me with a neutral, professional expression. "Good morning, ma'am," he said. "We are here for the scheduled pack-out. We have orders to clear the entire property by 5 o'clock this evening." I felt the air leave my lungs. I blinked, trying to understand the words. Pack out? Clear the property? There must be some mistake. I did not hire any movers. I am not going anywhere. The man looked down at his clipboard and then back at me. He looked a little uncomfortable, but his voice remained firm. "I have the work order right here, ma'am. This property was sold 3 weeks ago to a real estate development group. The closing happened yesterday. According to our instructions, the new owners want the site cleared immediately so they can begin the demolition process." Demolition. The word hit me like a physical blow. I felt the world tilt on its axis. "Demolition?" I whispered. My voice sounded thin, like paper tearing. "This is my house. I have lived here for 30 years. I am a retired schoolteacher. My husband and I paid off this mortgage with our own blood and sweat. You cannot just demolish it." The mover sighed and showed me a digital copy of a document on his tablet. My eyes were blurry, but I could see the address clearly. I could see the signature at the bottom. It was my signature, the messy, trembling scrawl I had made when Madison told me she was just helping with the bills, but right next to it, in bold, clear letters, was the name Madison Taylor. She was listed as the primary seller. "I am sorry, ma'am," the man said, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of pity in his eyes. "But the paperwork is all in order. This house belongs to the developer now. They are planning to build a high-rise apartment complex here. We have a crew of 12 people ready to start packing. My instructions are to move everything into a short-term storage facility across town." I leaned against the doorframe, my body trembling so hard that I thought I might collapse. I looked past the movers at my garden. I looked at the oak trees George and I had planted when Madison was just a toddler. I looked at the porch where we had celebrated every birthday, every Christmas, every small victory. Within minutes, the house was filled with the sound of chaos. The sound of tape guns screaming as they sealed boxes. The sound of heavy boots on my hardwood floors. Men were walking through my living room, picking up my family photos, my books, my antique lamps. They were handling my memories as if they were just items on a list. "Wait!" I cried out, but my voice was lost in the noise. "Please, just give me a minute. I need to call my daughter. There has been a terrible mistake. She would never do this. She told me she was helping me." The movers did not stop. They were professionals. They had a job to do. I stumbled into the kitchen, my hands fumbling for my phone. I felt like a stranger in my own home. I felt like a ghost watching my own life being erased. Everything I had worked for, every sacrifice I had made for 30 years, was being packed into cardboard boxes and loaded onto a truck. I finally managed to find my phone, but my fingers were shaking so much that I could barely unlock the screen. I was crying now. Hot, bitter tears of confusion and betrayal. I dialed Madison's number. I prayed that she would pick up. I prayed that she would tell me this was all a nightmare, a clerical error, a joke. I just wanted to go back to my tea and my blue jays. I just wanted my sanctuary back. The phone rang 4 times before she finally answered. When Madison's voice came through the speaker, it did not sound like the daughter I knew. There was no warmth. There was no concern. Her voice was sharp, polished, and incredibly cold. "Mom, I assumed you would be calling," she said, without even saying hello. Madison. Madison. Please." I sobbed into the phone. "There are men here. They are in the living room. They are taking the furniture. They say the house is being demolished. They say you sold it. Tell them to stop. Please, tell them they have the wrong house." There was a long, chilling silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of city traffic in the background and the clinking of a glass. "They have the right house, Mom," Madison said. Her voice was flat, completely devoid of emotion. "I sold the property. The deal closed yesterday. You should have received a packet of papers about your new apartment. I had it couriered to you this morning." I felt a sharp pain in my chest. "Sold it? How could you sell it? This was our home. This was George's legacy. I worked 30 years of teaching, to make sure you had a roof over your head. You told me you were just helping with the bills. Oh, please." "Mom," she snapped, and I could practically hear her rolling her eyes. "Let's be realistic. That house was a crumbling shack in a boring, middle-class neighborhood. It was surrounded by old people and overgrown trees. It was holding me back. I am 29 years old. I deserve a life that actually reflects my potential." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Your potential? Madison, I am your mother. I'm sick. I have Parkinson's. Where am I supposed to go? I already told you." "There is an apartment," she said, her tone dripping with impatience. "It is a small studio in the North District. It is close to the clinic. It is much more practical for someone in your condition. You don't need all that space. You don't need a garden. You just need a place to sit and wait." "A place to wait?" I whispered. "Wait for what? Madison? Wait to die? Life moves on." "Mom," she said, her voice growing louder and more arrogant. "You had your time. Now, it is my turn. Do you have any idea how much that dirt was worth? A developer paid $1.6 million for that lot. $1.6 million. Do you know what I can do with that kind of money?" I was stunned into silence. $1.6 million. To her, my home was just a number. My memories were just a transaction. "I have already moved into a luxury condo downtown," she continued, her voice filled with a sickening kind of pride. "I have a view of the entire city. I have a concierge, a gym, and a wardrobe that actually looks like it belongs on a successful woman. I bought clothes today that cost more than your car. Mom, I am finally living the life I was meant to live. I'm not going to spend the best years of my life playing nurse to an old woman in a dusty cottage." The cruelty of her words was like a knife to my heart. I looked around my kitchen, at the height marks we had carved into the pantry door as she grew up. I looked at the spot on the floor where she had taken her first steps. I had given her everything. I had lived a life of frugality and hard work so she could have the best of everything. And this was my reward. "You stole my life for a wardrobe." "Madison?" I asked, my voice finally turning from sadness to a cold, hard anger. "You sold my roof for a few designer labels?" "I didn't steal anything," she laughed. A short, hollow sound. "You signed the papers. You gave me the authority. If you were too confused to read the fine print, that is not my fault. It is just business. Mom, I am doing what is best for my future. Now, I have to go. I have a dinner reservation at a place that doesn't even allow people over 65 without a dress code. Enjoy your new apartment." The line went dead. I stood there, in the middle of my kitchen, surrounded by strangers in grey uniforms, and I felt a strange, terrifying clarity. The daughter I had raised, the girl I had loved more than my own life, was gone. In her place was a monster of vanity and greed. I looked down at my hand. It was still shaking. But for the first time in months, it wasn't just from the Parkinsons. It was from a deep, burning fire of resolve. Madison thought she was clever. She thought she had won. She thought that because I was old and sick, I was powerless. But as I looked out the window at the driveway, I remembered something. I remembered a conversation I had with George 20 years ago. I remembered a map he had drawn on a napkin, and a legal trust he had set up in secret. Madison had sold the house. She had sold the land, but she had forgotten to check the property lines. She had forgotten that her father was the best surveyor in the state, and he had left me one final gift. A gift that was about to turn her $1.6 million dream into a total nightmare. The first thing I noticed about my new life was the smell. It was not the smell of lavender and fresh-cut grass that I had enjoyed for 30 years. No, this new place smelled of stale cigarette smoke, old cooking oil, and the damp, heavy scent of a basement that had never seen the sun. The movers had dropped my boxes in the middle of a tiny studio apartment in the North District. It was a part of town I used to avoid even during the day. The walls were a sickly shade of yellow, the kind of color that makes you feel tired just by looking at it. There was one small window, but it looked out onto a brick wall and a rusted fire escape. I sat down on the edge of my old bed, which now took up nearly half of the entire room. My hand was shaking so violently that I had to sit on it to keep it still. I felt like a discarded toy. I felt like a piece of furniture that had been moved out of the way because it no longer fit the decor. Outside, the sounds of the city were relentless. Sirens were screaming at all hours of the night. People were shouting in the hallway, and the constant, rhythmic thumping of bass from a car stereo parked downstairs. For someone who had lived in the quiet peace of the suburbs, this was a special kind of torture. I tried to unpack, but every box I opened felt like a fresh wound. I pulled out a framed photo of George, and I started to cry. I had nowhere to hang it. I pulled out my favorite tea set, but the tiny kitchenette only had room for a single burner and a sink that leaked. I realized then that Madison had not just sold my house. She had stripped away my dignity. She had taken a woman who had served her community for 30 years, and she had tucked her away in a dark corner, where no one would have to look at her. But the worst part was the silence from Madison herself. She did not call to see if I had arrived safely. She did not check to see if I had food or if I could find my medicine. To her, I was a problem that had been solved. One evening, out of a desperate, aching need to see my daughter's face, I opened my phone. I went to her social media page. I knew it would hurt, but I could not help myself. The screen glowed in the dark room. There was Madison. She was standing on a balcony with a glass of champagne in her hand. Behind her, the city lights of downtown sparkled like diamonds. She was wearing a dress that looked like it was made of liquid silk. The caption read, "Finally living the life I was born for. No more anchors, no more old ghosts. Just me and the view." I scrolled further. There were photos of her new wardrobe, row after row of designer shoes, handbags that cost more than my entire year of retirement pension. She was smiling, a bright, artificial smile that did not reach her eyes. She looked like a stranger. I looked around my dark, cramped studio. I looked at the peeling wallpaper and the stained carpet. I realized that my 30 years of sacrifice, my 30 years of grading papers and saving pennies, had been converted into those silk dresses and those leather handbags. I was living in the shadows so that she could stand in the light. I felt a wave of bitterness so strong it made me gag. I was her mother. I had taught her how to walk. I had taught her how to read. I had given her the very foundation of her life, and she had traded me for a label. She had sold her mother's security for a moment of vanity. I turned off the phone and sat in the dark. The sirens outside seemed to be mocking me. I felt old. I felt weak. I felt defeated. I thought that this was how my story would end, forgotten in a studio apartment in a bad part of town. But as I sat there, my foot brushed against one of the boxes the movers had tucked under the bed. It was a heavy wooden box, one that I had not opened since the day George died. The box was made of solid oak. George had built it himself to hold his most important tools and documents. It had been sitting in the back of our hall closet for a decade, gathering dust. I had forgotten it was even there. But in this small apartment, there was nowhere to hide from the past. With trembling hands, I pulled the box out from under the bed. The wood felt cool and sturdy. I opened the lid, and the smell of old paper and ink filled the room. It was the smell of George. Inside were his old surveying tools, his brass compass, his measuring tapes, and dozens of rolled-up blueprints. George had been a professional surveyor for the city and for private clients for over 40 years. He was a man of precision. He believed that the earth had rules, and those rules were written in boundaries and property lines. I started to unroll the maps. Most of them were from projects he had worked on 40 years ago. But then, I found a large, yellowed envelope at the bottom of the box. On the front, in George's neat, architectural handwriting, were the words, "For Mary, our sanctuary." My heart skipped a beat. I opened the envelope and pulled out a detailed survey map of our property, the property Madison had just sold. I remembered the day George drew this. It was 20 years ago. We were sitting on the porch, and he was explaining the legalities of land ownership to me. "Mary, listen to me," he had said that day. His voice was steady and serious. "The house is important, but the land is what matters. I have seen developers ruin neighborhoods because they didn't respect the lines." As I studied the map, I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. George had been very clever. When we bought the house, the driveway was part of a larger parcel that belonged to the city. George had spent 2 years negotiating to buy that specific strip of land. But he did not put it in our names. He had created a private trust. It was called the George and Mary Access Trust. According to the map, the house and the backyard sat on one lot. The lot Madison had sold. But the driveway, the only point of access from the main road to the house, was owned by the trust, and I was the sole trustee. I leaned in closer, my eyes straining in the dim light of the studio. I looked at the property lines. The developer's lot was landlocked. To the left was a steep ravine. To the right was a historic stone wall that could not be moved. To the back was a protected forest. The only way to get a bulldozer, a crane, or a truck onto that property was to drive over the 60-foot strip of land owned by my trust. I felt a sudden, electric jolt of energy. The shaking in my hands stopped for a moment. I remembered George's smile. He always told me that he wanted to make sure I was always protected, even if he wasn't there to hold my hand. He knew how the world worked. He knew that sometimes people get greedy. Madison had sold the house. She had sold the dirt under the house. But she had sold something that was essentially a cage. She had sold a property that no one could get into without my permission. I spent the rest of the night reading the trust documents. They were ironclad. They had been filed with the county recorder 20 years ago and were never changed. The trust was separate from the house deed. When I signed the papers for Madison, I only signed the deed for the house and the primary lot. I never signed over the trust. Madison was so blinded by the $1.6 million price tag, so obsessed with her new downtown life, that she never did a full title search on the access point. She assumed the driveway came with the house. I sat back against the wall. A cold, calm feeling washing over me. For the last 2 weeks, I had felt like a victim. I had felt like a weak, old woman who had been outsmarted by her own child. But now, I was the one with the power. Madison wanted her designer lifestyle. She wanted her luxury condo and her champagne. She had traded her mother's love for a pile of money. But that money was tied to a project that could not start without my signature. The developers were planning to build a high-rise apartment complex. Every day the project was delayed. It would cost them thousands of dollars in interest and fees, and they couldn't even move a single shovelful of dirt without crossing my land. I looked at the photo of George on the nightstand. I whispered a thank you to the man who was still taking care of me from the beyond. Madison thought she had ended my story. She thought she had left me to rot in the shadows. She was wrong. My story was just beginning, and it was time to show my daughter that you can never truly build a future if you are willing to destroy the very path that brought you there. I spent the next 48 hours in that cramped, dim studio apartment. But for the first time, I did not feel like a prisoner. I felt like a general preparing for battle. I had the large, yellowed survey map spread out across my bed. I had my reading glasses on, and I was using a magnifying glass to trace every single line that George had drawn 20 years ago. George was always a man who looked at the world in terms of inches and feet. He used to say, "Mary, the law is written on the ground before it is ever written on paper." As I studied the map, I realized exactly what he meant. The property that Madison had sold for $1.6 million was a beautiful, rectangular piece of land. It was 3/4 of an acre. On paper, it looked like the perfect spot for a luxury apartment complex. But there was a hidden, fatal weakness that Madison and the developers had completely overlooked. The house sat on a hill. To the east, there was a steep ravine that dropped 60 feet down into a creek. You could not build a road there. To the west, there was a historic stone wall that had been protected by the city since the 1920s. You could not tear it down. To the north, there was a dense, protected forest that was part of a state park. The only way onto that land, the only possible entrance for a bulldozer, a crane, or a truck, was a narrow strip of land that ran from the main road to the front gate. It was a driveway, 60 feet long and 20 feet wide, and that driveway was not part of the sale. I looked at the deed Madison had forced me to sign. It described the lot, but it used the legal term, excluding the private access easement as defined in the George and Mary Access Trust. Madison was 29 years old. She was in a hurry. She wanted the money. She wanted the clothes. She wanted the penthouse. She had seen the $1.6 million figure, and her brain had simply shut off. She assumed the driveway came with the house because, well, why wouldn't it? But George had been smarter than that. He had seen the way the city was growing. He had seen developers buying up old family homes and turning them into concrete jungles. He wanted to make sure that if anyone ever tried to take our sanctuary, they would have to deal with me first. He had placed that specific strip of land into a private trust. I was the sole trustee. I was the only person on this earth who could sign a piece of paper allowing a vehicle to cross that driveway. Without my signature, that $1.6 million lot was nothing more than a very expensive, landlocked island. I sat back and took a deep breath. My hand was still shaking from the Parkinson's, but my mind was clear. I felt a surge of pride in my husband. He was still protecting me, even now, 10 years after he had passed away. He had given me the ultimate leverage. I spent the rest of the night writing a formal letter. I used my old school teacher voice. I was clear. I was firm. I was professional. I stated that as the trustee of the George and Mary Access Trust, I was formally closing the private driveway to all unauthorized traffic. I cited the specific plot numbers and the trust documents filed with the county. I knew what would happen next. The developer had a timeline. They had investors. They had millions of dollars on the line. Every day they were not building. They were losing money. They were probably planning to start the demolition on Monday morning. I looked at the photo of Madison on my phone. She was at another party, wearing another expensive outfit that I had paid for with my home. She looked so confident. She thought she had won. She thought I was just an old woman waiting for the end in a dark apartment. She had no idea. She had sold the house, but she had forgotten that she didn't own the path to get there. And without the path, the house was worthless. I folded the letter and placed it in an envelope. I felt a sense of calm that I had not felt since the movers arrived. I was not just a victim anymore. I was a landowner. I was a trustee. And I was about to show my daughter that 30 years of hard work and integrity cannot be erased by a single signature. Monday morning arrived with a grey, heavy sky. I took a bus back to my old neighborhood. I could not afford a taxi, but I did not care. I had my trust documents in my old leather briefcase, and I had a folding chair. When I arrived at my old house, my heart broke all over again. The windows were boarded up. The roses I had tended for decades were being trampled by workers in yellow vests. A massive, yellow excavator was idling at the edge of the road, its engine letting out a deep, rhythmic growl that shook the ground. I walked straight to the entrance of my driveway. I unfolded my chair, and I sat down, right in the middle of the path. A foreman, a large man with a red face and a hard hat, walked over to me. He looked annoyed. He looked like a man who was used to getting his way. "Ma'am, you can't sit here," he said, his voice loud and impatient. "We have a demolition schedule to keep. That machine needs to get through in the next 5 minutes. You are trespassing on private property." I looked up at him and gave him my best schoolteacher stare, the one that used to make the rowdiest teenagers go quiet. "Actually, sir, I believe you are the confused one," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "You are correct that the lot behind me was sold, but this strip of land, this driveway, is owned by a private trust. I am the trustee, and I have not given you, or your company, to permission to cross it." The foreman laughed. It was a loud, arrogant sound. "Look, lady, I don't know what you are talking about. Our company bought this whole place. We have the permits. We have the deed. Now, move the chair before I have to call the police to move it for you." I did not flinch. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the certified copy of the survey map and the trust agreement. I held them out to him. "I suggest you call your legal department before you call the police," I said. "If you move that excavator 1 inch onto this gravel, you will be committing a felony trespass against a private trust. I have already filed a formal notice with the county sheriff this morning. This land is not part of your purchase." The foreman snatched the papers from my hand. He started to read, and I watched as the color drained from his face. He looked at the map, then he looked at the steep ravine to the east, then he looked at the historic wall to the west. He was a construction man. He knew exactly what he was looking at. He walked away and started pacing back and forth, barking into his cell phone. I sat in my chair and waited. I watched the engine of the excavator puff out black smoke. I watched the other workers standing around, confused. 10 minutes later, a black SUV pulled up to the curb. A man in an expensive suit stepped out. He was the lead developer, the man who had bought the house from Madison. He walked over to me, trying to look friendly, but I could see the panic in his eyes. "Mrs. Taylor, is it?" he asked, his voice smooth and oily. "There seems to be a small misunderstanding about the access rights. I am sure we can settle this quickly. My company is prepared to offer you $5,000 for a temporary construction easement. It is a very generous offer for a simple driveway." I looked at him, and I thought about the dark studio apartment. I thought about the smell of stale smoke. I thought about Madison laughing on her balcony with her champagne. $5,000? I asked. I let out a short, dry laugh. "Sir, my daughter sold you this house for $1.6 million. She told me I was a burden. She told me I should just sit and wait for the end. She sold my 30 years of memories for a designer wardrobe. The developer shifted his weight. Look, I understand you are upset with your daughter, but that is a family matter. We are a business. We just want to build our apartments. Then you should have done a better title search, I said. I stood up, my hand shaking, but my spirit as tall as the oak trees behind me. I am not selling you an easement, not for $5,000, not for $50,000. I am not selling at all. I am the trustee of this land, and I am using my power to protect the peace of this neighborhood. This project is over. You can't do this, the developer shouted, his friendly mask finally slipping. We have millions of dollars invested. We will sue you. We will sue your daughter for misrepresenting the property. I am sure you will, I said, and I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. And I wish you the best of luck with that. Madison was very confident when she sold you this land. I am sure she will be just as confident in court. I picked up my chair and started walking back toward the bus stop. I did not look back. Behind me, I heard the foreman shouting orders to shut down the engines. The roar of the excavator faded into a whistle, then silence. The project had stalled before the first brick was ever moved. Madison had sold my roof, but I still held the key to the front gate, and I was not going to let anyone in. For the next 2 weeks, my telephone did not stop ringing. I had moved back into that tiny, dark studio apartment, but I no longer felt small within its walls. I felt like a mountain that could not be moved. The developer, a man whose name was Mr. Henderson, called me every single morning. At first, he tried to be my friend. He spoke to me as if I were his own grandmother. He told me he understood my pain. He told me that Madison had been very difficult to work with, and he wanted to make things right. Mrs. Taylor, he said, his voice sounding like smooth honey over the phone. I have talked to my partners. We want to offer you $100,000 for the access rights, just for the driveway. You keep the land. We just get to drive our trucks over it. Think of what you could do with $100,000. You could move out of that apartment. You could live in a beautiful assisted living facility with a garden and a chef. I listened to him, and I looked at the peeling wallpaper of my room. $100,000 is a lot of money to a retired teacher. It could have brought me a lot of comfort, but I remembered the call. A rogue look in Madison's eyes when she told me life moves on. I remembered her laughing at my 30 years of sacrifice. Mr. Henderson, I said, my voice calm and steady. I spent 30 years teaching children that some things are not for sale. My integrity is one of them. My husband's legacy is another. You and my daughter decided that my life was worth nothing. You decided that my sanctuary was just an obstacle in your way. My answer is no. When the bribes did not work, the threats began. The honey in his voice turned to vinegar. He told me that his legal team was the best in the state. He told me they would tie me up in court for years. He said they would sue me for tortious interference with a business contract. He said I would die in a courtroom, penniless and alone. We will bury you in paperwork. Old woman, he hissed, his professional mask finally falling away. You have Parkinson's. You can barely hold a pen. Do you really think you can survive a 10-year legal battle against a billion-dollar corporation? I sat in my chair, and I took a deep breath. My hand was shaking. Yes. But my heart was not. Mr. Henderson, I replied. I have already lost my home. I have already lost my daughter. What else can you possibly take from me? I have plenty of time, and I have the truth on my side. Every day that your trucks are sitting idle, you are losing thousands of dollars. I am just a woman in a small apartment. I can wait forever. Can you? The line went silent for a long time. Then he slammed the phone down. I knew I was doing the right thing. It wasn't about the money. I could have asked for 500,000 or even $1 million. But if I took their money, I would be just like Madison. I would be putting a price tag on my soul. The project stalled. The massive excavator was hauled away on a flatbed truck. The workers stopped showing up. The lot, my beautiful 3/4 acre lot, became a graveyard of broken dreams and weeds. The neighbors, people I had known for 20 years, started calling me. They thanked me. They didn't want a high-rise apartment complex in their quiet neighborhood. They wanted the trees and the birds. I realized that by holding onto that 60-foot strip of gravel, I was protecting more than just myself. I was protecting the peace of everyone. Madison had sold my roof, but I was still the guardian of the gate. While I was finding my peace, Madison's world was starting to burn. The developers were not the kind of people who accepted a loss quietly. They had paid Madison $1.6 million for a property they could not use. They had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on permits, architects, and marketing. And now, they had a landlocked piece of dirt that was worth less than a used car. They did not blame me. They knew I was the rightful owner of the trust. They blamed the person who had signed the contract, promising that the property was fully accessible and ready for development. They blamed Madison. In her greed and her hurry to buy that penthouse, Madison had signed a series of legal warranties. She had guaranteed that there were no encumbrances or access issues. She had lied, or at least, she had been too lazy to check the truth. And in the world of high-stakes real estate, that is a very expensive mistake. I heard the news through a former colleague who still lived near Madison's new building. The developer had filed a massive lawsuit against my daughter for fraud and breach of contract. They were not just asking for their $1.6 million back. They were suing her for damages, for lost profits, and for their legal fees. The total was nearly $3 million. Madison thought she had won the lottery. She thought that $1.6 million made her untouchable. But she did not understand that when you build a life on a foundation of betrayal, the weight of that life will eventually crush you. She had to hire her own expensive lawyers. I heard that her legal team was charging her $700 an hour. Every week, she was bleeding money. One evening, I saw a new post on her social media. It was very different from the champagne and balconies. She was sitting in her designer walk-in closet. But she wasn't smiling. She was holding a luxury handbag. A limited edition piece that probably cost $10,000. The caption read, "Selling some of my favorite pieces to make room for new things. Serious inquiries only." I knew what that meant. She wasn't making room for new things. She was selling her wardrobe to pay for her defense. She was selling her vanity to pay for her lies. The irony was almost too much to bear. She had sold my house to buy those clothes. And now she was selling those clothes to pay for the house she no longer owned. Then came the news that her penthouse was back on the market. She couldn't keep up with the monthly association fees and the mortgage. Her status was evaporating like mist in the morning sun. The people she called friends, the socialites and the influencers, disappeared as soon as the smell of a lawsuit arrived. She was alone, just like she had left me. But there was a difference. I was alone with my integrity. I was alone with the memory of George and the knowledge that I had stood my ground. Madison was alone with a mountain of debt and a heart full of bitterness. I sat in my small apartment, watching the sun set over the brick wall outside my window. I didn't feel happy about Madison's suffering. I am a mother, and a part of me still remembers the little girl who used to hold my hand in the garden. But I also knew that some lessons can only be learned in the dark. Madison had believed that money was the ultimate accessory. She believed it could hide her bankrupt soul. But the money was gone now. The clothes were being sold to strangers. The penthouse was empty. The project was dead. The developer was furious. And my daughter was about to discover what happens when you try to buy a new beginning with someone else's ending. The law was finally catching up to her. And I was the one holding the map that led the way. There is an old saying that I used to teach my students. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. I watched that ancient truth play out in real time as my daughter's life began to crumble like a sandcastle in a rising tide. Madison had built her entire identity on a foundation of sand. She believed that her status was defined by the zip code where she lived, the brand of the car she drove, and the names on the labels inside her closet. She thought she was untouchable because she had $1.6 million in the bank. But she did not realize that money is a fickle friend, especially when that money was obtained through the betrayal of her own mother. The legal battle with the developer was relentless. They were a massive corporation, and they did not like losing money. They had a team of lawyers who were paid to be sharks. Every time Madison went to court, she looked a little smaller, a little more tired. The first thing to go was the Italian sports car. I heard from a neighbor that it was hauled away on a flatbed truck because she had stopped making the lease payments. Then, the penthouse itself was listed for sale. The luxury condo with the floor-to-ceiling windows and the marble floors was no longer her sanctuary. It was her cage. She was forced to sell it at a loss just to cover the initial settlement demands from the developer. But the most painful part for Madison was the wardrobe. I sat in my small studio apartment and I read the public auction notices. She was selling everything: the silk dresses, the Italian leather boots. The handbags cost $5,000 each. She held a private sale at a local boutique to raise cash for her lawyers. I can only imagine the humiliation she felt. For a woman who lived for the envy of others, having to sell her finery to the very women she used to look down upon was a special kind of hell. Her high society friends, the people who had toasted her with champagne in her penthouse, were nowhere to be found. They did not want to be associated with a woman who was being sued for fraud. They did not want to be near the stench of a failing reputation. Madison had traded her mother's love for a designer life. And now, both were gone. By the end of the first year, her bank account was nearly empty. The $1.6 million had been swallowed up by legal fees, court costs, and the massive penalties she had to pay for misrepresenting the property. She was no longer a Kiko Thurng Lu, a high society lady. She was just a defendant. I saw a photo of her leaving the courthouse one afternoon. It was in a local digital newspaper. She wasn't wearing silk, she was wearing a simple, wrinkled blouse, and her hair was pulled back in a messy knot. The arrogance was gone. In its place was a look of pure, exhausted desperation. She had sold my house to buy a dream, but the dream had turned into a nightmare. She had sold my roof for a moment of vanity, and now the sky was falling on her head. I felt a deep, aching sadness for her, not because I wanted to help her, but because I realized that she had never truly understood what a home was. She thought a home was a place to show off. She never knew that a home was a place to be loved. Her sandcastle was gone. The waves of truth and law had washed it away, leaving nothing but the cold, hard ground. While Madison's world was ending, mine was beginning to bloom again. 18 months after I'd sat in that driveway in my folding chair, the legal dust finally settled. The developer, exhausted by the delays and the mounting interest on their loans, finally realized they were never going to build their high-rise complex. I had held my ground. I had refused every bribe. I had stood as a wall between them and their greed. Eventually, the project was officially cancelled. The developer moved on to another city, another project. But they still had a problem. They owned a piece of land that they could not get into. In the end, we settled. It was handled by a very kind lawyer who specialized in protecting the rights of seniors. He worked for a non-profit, and he took great joy in helping me. The developer agreed to pay me a significant sum of money, $400,000, to buy the access rights so they could sell the land to a local conservancy group. The conservancy group wanted to turn the lot into a public park and a bird sanctuary, to honor the memory of the trees and the neighborhood. I agreed immediately. It was exactly what George would have wanted. When I received that settlement check, I didn't go to a designer boutique. I didn't look for a penthouse. Instead, I took the bus out to the countryside, about 20 miles from the city. I was looking for a place where I could breathe. I found it on a quiet lane, surrounded by old maples and wild roses. It was a small, white cottage with a wide, wraparound porch. It wasn't grand. It wasn't expensive, but it was sturdy. It was honest. The day I moved in, I felt as though 30 years of weight had been lifted from my heart. I used the money to make the house fully accessible for my Parkinson's. I put in smooth, hardwood floors, wide doorways, and a beautiful walk-in shower with marble tiles that reminded me of the clouds. I bought a new bed with soft linen sheets that smelled like the sun. I spent my first morning on the porch, sitting in a rocking chair with a cup of hot tea. My hand was still shaking, but it didn't bother me as much. Here, there was no one to judge me. There was only the sound of the wind in the leaves and the song of the chickadees. I realized then that life does not end because you get old. It does not end because you get sick. It only ends when you stop believing in your own worth. I used the rest of the money to set up a small scholarship fund for future teachers. I wanted to make sure that 30 years of my life meant something more than just a house. I wanted to invest in the next generation of people who would teach children about integrity and love. My new home is filled with light. In the afternoons, the sun pours through the kitchen windows, illuminating the photos of George that I finally have a place to hang. I have a small garden now, where I grow tomatoes and lavender. It is not as big as my old garden, but every plant is a testament to my survival. I had been cast into the shadows. I had been discarded like an old toy, but I had found my way back into the light. I had learned that you cannot buy a new beginning with someone else's ending. I had lost my old sanctuary, but I had built a new one on the foundation of the truth. I sat on my porch, and I looked at the sunset. For the first time in a very long time, I felt safe. I was no longer a victim of my daughter's greed. I was the master of my own peace. The ashes of my old life had been blown away, and in their place, a beautiful, quiet, and dignified future was beginning to grow. 2 years had passed since I first turned the key in the lock of my new cottage. 2 years of quiet mornings. 2 years of tending to my small garden. And 2 years of healing from a wound that I once thought would never close. My life now was simple, and that was exactly how I wanted it. The tremors in my hand had not gone away, but they had softened, in the peace of the countryside. Away from the sirens and the stress of the city, my body had finally found a rhythm it could live with. It was a late Tuesday afternoon in October. The air was crisp, and the leaves on the old maple trees were turning a deep, fiery red. I was sitting on my front porch, wrapped in a thick, hand-knit wool sweater. I had a book in my lap, though I was mostly just watching the golden light of the sunset filter through the branches. Everything felt right. Everything felt earned. Then, I noticed a figure walking along the narrow asphalt road that led past my property. At first, I thought it was just a traveler, or perhaps a neighbor from further down the lane. But as the person drew closer, I realized something was wrong. The woman was walking with a heavy, slumped posture. She was wearing a thin grey hooded sweatshirt that was stained and faded. Her jeans were frayed at the bottom, and she was wearing a pair of old sneakers that looked 3 sizes too big for her. In her right hand, she was carrying a single, white plastic grocery bag. It looked light, as if it only held a few meager items. As she reached the edge of my garden, she stopped. She looked up at the cottage, and then her eyes met mine. I felt a sudden, cold jolt in my chest. Even through the dirt and the exhaustion, even with her hair matted and her face thin and pale, I knew those eyes. It was Madison. My daughter stood there, shivering in the autumn breeze. The girl who had once stood on a penthouse balcony with a glass of champagne was now a ghost of herself. The girl who had traded her mother's home for a designer wardrobe was now dressed in rags that even a thrift store would reject. I did not move. I did not speak. I simply watched her. She took a hesitant step toward my porch. She looked at the beautiful, white railings. She looked at the blooming lavender and the neat stone path. I could see the reflection of her own failure in her eyes. "Mom?" she whispered. Her voice was thin and cracked. It sounded like it had been months since she had spoken to anyone with kindness. I remained silent, my heart beating in a slow, heavy thud. "Mom, please," she said, and she began to sob. It was a dry, hollow sound. I didn't know where else to go. I didn't think I would find you here. She walked closer, until she was standing at the bottom of my porch steps. The smell of her reached me then. It was the smell of poverty. It was the smell of someone who lived in places that did not have running water or heat. I lost everything. "Mom," she said, the words spilling out of her in a desperate rush. "The lawyers, the settlements, the debt collectors, they took it all. They took the condo. They took the car. They even took the clothes. I tried to find a job, but my reputation was ruined. No one would hire me after the developer's lawsuit was in the papers." She looked down at her plastic bag. "I am living in a shack. Mom, it is a tiny shed behind an old garage in the North District. It has a dirt floor. I have been sleeping on a pile of old blankets. I haven't had a proper shower in 3 weeks. I haven't had a hot meal since Sunday." I looked at her thin, trembling frame. I remembered the day she had sat in my kitchen and told me that she deserved a life of luxury. I remembered how she had laughed when I asked her where I was supposed to go. "You sold my roof for a moment of vanity. Madison," I said, my voice sounding like a distant bell in the quiet afternoon. "I know," she cried, dropping her plastic bag on the grass. "I was a fool. I was selfish. But I am your daughter. You have this beautiful house. You have space. Please, just let me stay for a few days. Just long enough to get on my feet. I am cold. Mom, I am so cold." I looked at the sunset over my garden. I looked at the peace I had built from the ashes of her betrayal. I realized then that the woman standing before me was not my daughter. My daughter was the little girl who used to play in the oak trees. This woman was a stranger who had tried to destroy me for a label. The silence between us stretched out, long and heavy. The wind rustled the red leaves, and for a moment, I could almost hear George's voice in the breeze. He had built the trust to protect me. He had drawn the lines to keep me safe. And I realized that my sanctuary was not just a building. It was a boundary. It was a line that she had crossed a long time ago. Madison climbed the first step of the porch, her hand reaching out for the railing. She looked at me with a desperate, pleading expression. She thought that because I was a mother, I would always be a victim of my own love. She thought that her tears would wash away the memory of the moving trucks and the dark studio apartment. "Mom, please," she sobbed again. "I'm your only child. You can't leave me out here like this. I have nowhere else to go. The sky is my only roof now." I stood up slowly. My hand was shaking, but my legs were strong. I looked down at her from the top of the porch. "Do you remember what you told me?" "Madison?" I asked. My voice was calm, but it had the weight of a mountain. 2 years ago, when I was crying on the floor of my kitchen, when I was watching my life being packed into boxes. "Do you remember what you said?" Madison flinched. She tried to look away, but I held her gaze. "You told me that life moves on," I said. "You told me that you were tired of being surrounded by old people and old ghosts. You told me that I didn't need a garden, that I just needed a place to sit and wait." I took a step forward, coming to the very edge of the porch. "Well, Madison, as you said, life has moved on. I have moved on. My access rights, the very thing you forgot to check, are currently being used to protect the peace of this neighborhood. And my home, this sanctuary, is currently being used to protect the peace of my soul." "Mom," You can't be serious, she whispered. You are going to turn me away? In this condition? I am not turning you away, I replied. I am simply respecting the choice you made. You chose a world where people are treated like transactions. You chose a world where money is more important than family. You sold my ending to buy your beginning. And now, you are finding out that you cannot buy a new ending with a bankrupt soul. I looked her directly in the eyes. I think living in that shack will give you plenty of time to learn a very important lesson. A lesson that I tried to teach you for 30 years. A home is built on love, on integrity, and on the promises we keep. It is not built on designer labels or luxury condos. Madison looked at me, and for the first time, she realized that there was no way back. The door was not just closed, it was locked. I'm sorry, Madison, I said, but my sanctuary is full. There is only room here for the truth. I turned around and walked toward the front door. Mom! No, don't leave me, she screamed. I heard her fall to her knees on the porch steps. I heard the plastic bag rustle as she grabbed it. I heard her bitter cries echoing through the quiet trees. I reached the door, and I paused for just a second. I felt a pang of grief, the kind of grief you feel when you finally bury something dead for a long time. But I did not turn back. I stepped inside my warm, bright cottage, and I closed the door. I heard the click of the lock. It was the final sound I have ever heard. I walked to the kitchen, and I put the kettle on. I looked out the window. And I saw Madison slowly standing up. She picked up her plastic bag. She looked at the cottage one last time, and then she turned and began the lonely walk back toward the road. As the sun disappeared behind the hills, I realized that she was right about one thing. She did have the whole sky for a roof now, but she had no place to call home. Because a home is not just a place where you sleep, it is a place where you are wanted, and Madison had traded that away for a wardrobe full of shadows. I sat down at my table, and I poured my tea. My hand was steady. The house was quiet. The sanctuary was safe. I realized then that you cannot buy a new beginning by destroying someone else. And as I looked at the photo of George on the wall, I knew that the path he had surveyed for me had finally led me to exactly where I was meant to be. If you believe that a home is built on love and that justice is the most beautiful accessory anyone can wear, please like this video and subscribe to Elderly Stories. Thank you for staying with me until the end. May your own home always be filled with the truth. As I sit here on my porch, watching the fireflies dance in the twilight, I am struck by a deep sense of gratitude. The air here is clean, and the silence is a gift I never knew I needed. My hand is resting on the arm of my rocking chair. It is shaking, just a little bit, but I do not mind anymore. That tremor is just a part of my story. It is a reminder of the 30 years I spent teaching, and the life I fought to protect. I often think about that day Madison walked away from my gate. I wonder if she is still sitting in that shack behind the garage, looking at the same stars I am. I wonder if she has realized that the most expensive wardrobe in the world cannot keep you warm if your heart is cold. Madison believed that she could trade my 30 years of sacrifice for a moment of luxury. She believed that the $1.6 million she took from me would buy her a seat at a table where she didn't belong. But she forgot one very simple truth. A house is made of wood and stone, but a home, a real home, is built on the foundation of love and integrity. My husband, George, knew this. He was a man of the earth. He understood that a path is only as good as the person who walks it. He left me that trust because he knew that boundaries are not meant to keep people out. They are meant to keep the truth in. I am 70 years old now. I have lost a house, but I have gained a sanctuary. I have lost a daughter to greed, but I have found a community of neighbors who value character over designer labels. I have learned that you can never truly find a new beginning if you are willing to build it on someone else's ending. Please take a moment to reflect on your own journey. Remember that your legacy is not what you leave in a bank account, but what you leave in the hearts of the people you love. Note: while this story is a fictional narrative created to engage and inspire, the message and the lesson it carries are what is truly important. Those values have real value in our world today. If you believe that justice is the best accessory a person can wear, and if you believe that a home is a place of the soul, please like this video. Your support helps us share these messages of hope and integrity with more people. Do not forget to subscribe to Elderly Stories for more tales of wisdom and resilience. Thank you for spending your time with me today. May your own home always be a place of peace, and may your path always be clear. Good night, and God bless.